Welcome to Blueprints by Symbiotic. I'm Edgar Roth, and today we're thrilled to have Barnabé Monnot, co-lead of protocol at the Ethereum Foundation. At the beginning of February, Vitalik made a very interesting post, made the crypto Twitter very noisy. The L2's role as branded shards of Ethereum no longer really makes sense. Where do you think that rollup-centric roadmap may have under-delivered, and why it makes sense to reprioritize?
When the tweet was sent out, I was in Malaysia at an event where we gathered like a lot of L2s, and we were planning to have these workshops and discussions. It was not part of the plan to like put them in the room and have this tweet and see what happens. Many L2s don't see themselves as just network extensions of Ethereum, like the same as Ethereum, just like on a different place. Like they actually differentiate with their sequencing, with so many different other things. It just made sense to revisit that model. Having faster finality means that across the board, the network just becomes cheaper to use, like more seamless, more frictionless for capital to move around. I'm generally very positive that more institutions are paying attention. More capital is around, that also funds more innovation, that means there's more momentum. We should generally be welcoming to it.
So hello Barnabé, how are you doing today?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm doing great. Really excited about the upcoming little discussion we're going to have. As you know, we'll start with some rapid fire questions to kind of get the ball rolling. What is your favorite project in crypto that is not Ethereum?
I've been looking at Pay, private payment, which became an L2 recently. I've also been looking at Lighter, which is a PERT. So that's two answers, but I like them both.
Nice. If you were not working in crypto, which industry would you be in?
I might actually be working on something that has to do with cities, broadly speaking. That's sort of what I was a little bit doing before crypto. So yeah, thinking about financial flows and city planning, generally speaking, how these two tie together.
What's your favorite hot take on MEV?
My favorite hot take is that the EIP 1559 base fee is MEV.
Nice. What's the biggest myth in the space about interop?
I guess the biggest myth is that interop is solved. That's something you hear quite a lot in that community, and I feel like there's still a lot of work to be doing there.
Oh, for sure. In your opinion, what's the most underappreciated aspect of Ethereum?
I would say the resiliency of the community. It's been written off a couple of times, and it sometimes feels like we're losing steam or we're not as fast as others, but we tend to outlive most of the things that are thrown at us.
Yeah, that's definitely like something to highlight there. And not a lot of ecosystems can claim the same thing, for sure. Let's move into some long form questions. First, I'd love it if you could just like briefly like introduce yourself and specifically talk about like your role and your focus, your scope at the Ethereum Foundation. Like I was looking on LinkedIn and you had actually a lot of job title updates. So it would be great if you can walk us through like the different focus that you have in these different job titles. It appears that you are now co-lead of protocol. It would be great to probably like really understand like what that means. So yeah, feel free to continue.
Yeah, sounds good. I've been at the Ethereum Foundation for 6 years now, and my role has changed a little bit. I came in as a researcher initially, as part of the Robust Incentives Group, which is a research team that was focused on game theory and economics. I was a team lead of that team for 4 or 5 years. And after this, I started to take more responsibility generally at the foundation. The way the foundation is structured today is we have this protocol cluster or like a department. So like everything that has to do with protocol research and development. We have an ecosystem cluster. We have this privacy cluster, PSE. As people might know, we had quite a few changes internally with the foundation, like to try and set us up well for the future. And one of them was to have a more cohesive and integrated protocol cluster. And as part of these changes, I became the co-lead of that cluster along with Alex Stokes and Tim Beko. So it's mostly a managerial role, but it also allows me to think about resources, priorities, how do we set ourselves up organizationally to solve like the hard problems that Ethereum is facing.
Hard problems in what's in the design, in like the broader sense, in the For example, like what are some hard problems that you are not going to be solving?
Yeah, I think there's both the problems themselves, so things like faster finality, zkVM, scaling, improving UX, which is something I'm personally spending quite a bit of time on. And then there's more like the meta problems of thinking about we want to deliver value in the short term, and we also want to ship super ambitious stuff that takes many, many years like to achieve, because you need to have research, you need to have engineering, you need to deliver that to the chain. And so as an organization, like how do you set the slider between being more short-term focused and really like trying to solve problems that people encounter today, and having more of this long view of what the protocol is going to be in 5 years, in 10 years, etc. And yeah, I think a big challenge to me of the role has been to try to get people to find the sweet spot between these two places.
Super interesting. We'll dive into this like a little bit more about like what your priorities are like in terms of protocol design at the moment. But I want to zoom in a little bit on like the specific topic of L2s because beginning of February, Vitalik made a very interesting post that definitely like like made the crypto Twitter very noisy because initially he acknowledged that the L2's role as branded shards of Ethereum no longer really makes sense. I would love if you could like walk us through like the origins of like the rollup-centric roadmap and looking back, like where do you think that rollup-centric roadmap like may have under-delivered and why it makes sense to reprioritize on that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I should also say that when the tweet was sent out, I was in Malaysia at an event that we talked a little bit about on crypto Twitter, where we gathered like a lot of L2s, and we were planning to have these workshops and discussions. It was not part of the plan to like put them in the room and have this tweet and see what happens, but I think it was actually helpful to just be with them and talk about how they see their future, how we think about the integration between Ethereum L1, VL2s, and everything. But yeah, that's more like the present. Maybe like rewinding a little bit. So 2020, which is actually when I joined the foundation, and so I can also attest to this being like kind of a transitional moment. Like this was coming of um, like things like CryptoKitties had it was on top of people's mind as like, oh, the chain just cannot handle this capacity. This is obviously going to be like a blocker for people to deploy things for apps that are serious about having as many users as possible. So that felt like just an existential problem to solve. And so the solution that was at hand is, well, let's do like this if2 transition where we do the merge, like move to proof of stake, and we also have like this idea of execution sharding of so many different shards that can accommodate like hyperscale or whatever the term was at the time. That's actually fairly difficult to pull off. So first, like as we know, the move from proof of work to proof of stake was itself like extremely complicated, and then the design also of these shards and how they communicate with one another, like all the protocol design, the security that you want behind that was also like a lot of work. Like if you go back to if research around that time, there was so many posts that was discussing like the design space, which was so large. And at the same time, like, yeah, started appearing this idea of, well, you can actually do this trick of posting the data that is being executed on another domain and making sure that the execution that happened was secure. So like this idea of optimistic rollup and validity rollups or ZK rollups. And that option felt quite attractive, I think, at the time, to say, you know, shipping this execution sharding thing is going to be very difficult, take a long time. We should probably keep thinking about it. But at the same time, like we have this option of saying the private market can just step in, make the rollups themselves, and they can become this capacity increase that the network needs. And there's going to be like more questions to figure out about their economics, which I was thinking a little bit about at the time, their security, their user adoption models, like so many different questions. Interop was a big one as well. But yeah, it felt like, given the pressure of scaling and given the attractivity of the solution, like we might as well just move to that, and this seems to make sense. And I think, to be honest, I think it worked, but it's clear that there's a trade-off. Like when you ask other people to solve your problems, it's not always going to pan out like the exact same way that you would have wanted that to be. Like that's a typical principal agent problem. And so fast forward to now, it's clear that many L2s don't see themselves as just network extensions of Ethereum, like the same as Ethereum, just like on a different place. Like they actually differentiate with their sequencing, with so many different other things, their fees or whatever. And so, it just made sense to revisit that model, like especially in the context of ZK VM research has, considerably progressed. And so now L1 scale, L1 at maximum scale is really more and more at hand. And so does it make sense to think of rollups as just scaling solutions? That's probably no longer the case. And I think this was true for many of the rollups that were in the room back then in February. That's just saying that out loud is probably what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been quite fun to be in the room while the tweet went out. Like, were you expecting the tweet, or like was it a surprise to you as well?
I think we were having some discussions. We always have discussions internally anyways between Vitalik. Josh Rudolph is someone who's also working a lot on all the platform aspects of Ethereum. So how can Ethereum be a good platform for L2s, for L2 users and everything? So the discussions had been always very active on this topic. So it's not that much of a surprise perhaps, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But was it not a surprise to the crowd that was there? Like, were you like, were there some people that were pissed?
I don't think anybody was pissed. I don't know. I'm probably not the person to ask this, but I feel like over the next couple of days, it just led to so many productive discussions that maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise. So either way, I think it was good. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, at the origin of the L2, like when the first L2 started to really like strive, there was always this notion of alignment with Ethereum, and like this alignment maybe like has gotten like a bit harder to see it. Like you've said it yourself that like they are very very different from Ethereum, and that the alignment might not be uh evidence. What do you think like alignment actually means for an L2 in practice to Ethereum?
Yeah. There's been like discussion about technically what it means, socially what it means. If we stay at like the technical level, there's some 0 to 1, let's say, features that you can look at. For instance, do you buy your data availability from Ethereum, or do you use like a separate provider? Use ETH as the gas token. Um, yeah, maybe other like questions around the security councils and things like this, like how much do you inherit like the technical properties of Ethereum when it comes to censorship resistance, liveness, and safety, and all of this. And the social layer, I think that's where the question was always like very fuzzy, and people also got upset that like Polygon seems fairly aligned, like they think a lot in ways that are similar to Ethereum, like they use the EVM, so there's like so many different things. But they're not exactly like an L2 in other senses of the term, but it also doesn't feel like there's a huge conflict perhaps in certain places. So to me, like alignment has always been about almost like going back to the user models and the users that you want to serve. So it was the idea that if you're a user of the Ethereum L1, we can't send you out to like a different domain that's like less secure or that's too different from that, because we want you to have this Ethereum L1 experience like somewhere else. And so then it's very normative, like you say, your domain should look like Ethereum L1, like in many different ways. And we're not going to send people over if we don't believe that it's the case, like if you're not sufficiently aligned in this way. And the truth is that L2s, through their differentiation and through the choices that they made, they have attracted, I think, different categories of users that perhaps would not have used the Ethereum L1. And so then it makes sense to say, you don't necessarily need to be aligned with the L1 in the sense of you have to serve exactly the same user needs and in the same way. You might just want to serve your own users and do that the way that you know best how to do it. And then the alignment with the L1 might be a useful property or a useful feature that you bring to your users. Like, for instance, many of your users might be security conscious. And so knowing that your L2 buys DA from Ethereum, that might actually be something that they find attractive to use your platform. But in other places, perhaps that's not the case. Like maybe your users are fine with faster confirmations that come from a sequencer, or are fine with like different trade-offs that are made in different places. And so thinking of EL2s more as like consumers of properties of Ethereum, like and differentiated consumers, I think makes to me a little bit more sense perhaps than thinking of them as just mirrors of Ethereum L1. Yeah.
Now, and also, I guess that what a lot of people in the community were expecting in terms of of alignment is economic alignment, like value accrual for the Ethereum L1 for ETH token, and like have like grow the modes of the broader ecosystem, and have something being additive, whereas like versus something that could potentially be competitive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's also, it is important obviously to think about the network as a whole, like VL1 and VL2s. A lot of that network, the reason why it functions well is because there is ETH as a token in the center that secures it through proof of stake and through the gas being burnt, all of these like properties that we have. So yeah, this perspective also matters a lot, and I think this is maybe something that sometimes isn't repeated often enough. But definitely, yeah, I think that's also true.
Yeah. So now I'm curious, like after we have said all that, after like Vitalik's post, like in 2026 and moving forward, what are valid reasons to build an L2?
Yeah, I think one of the big reasons is defining it a bit. I would say building an L2 means for me like you build a chain that derives its consensus and its data availability from Ethereum. So like posts its data to Ethereum, and that means that users inherit like some of the security properties of Ethereum through those means. That to me is meaningful if, as an L2, you want to borrow or like refine maybe the liquidity that sits on the L1. So you see that there is like capital on the L1, and you want to make that capital like more active, and you want to ensure the holders of that capital, like the ultimate holders, that when they move to your system so that their capital is doing like something productive, they can always like they don't lose their property rights in the meantime. So they can always like go back to VL1 and understand like that's as secure as VL1. That to me is like a strong property. So it's one direction. Then the other direction is the L2 itself, I think, can be a very attractive funnel or like user adoption mechanism, because it's not always going to be that there's capital on VL1 and then that goes and does something useful on VL2. Like VL2 itself will say, these are the productive things you can do with your capital. And so the capital enters like through VL2 itself. But then it might be shy, or it might think twice about entering on VL2 if it doesn't feel like secure enough. And that security again is like inherited from VL1. And so I see these L2s as being at the nexus of broader users that maybe are not yet part of this capital pool, and existing capital that already sits on VL1. And I think this is, to me, like a very harmonious vision that can ensure that both sides find it advantageous to do business with one another, VL1 and VL2s.
Yeah. I think that's interesting what you said around like L2s being like a funnel, because like if you're a big company, you might want to have your own L2, and you want to capture that value by bringing them maybe from like your centralized exchange to your own L2, and that's going to be an easier user journey than like sending them to the L1 probably. But then like there poses the question potentially, like what if one of these L2s like outgrow the L1, and like there might be an incentive for like essentially like the composability layer to switch from the L1 to the L2, and like you could have like one big L2 like essentially trying to be its own L1, and for the users already on the L2, like maybe like that L2 that used to be dependent on Ethereum, it just becomes like a centralized L1. It might not change anything for the users. Maybe like for the users that care about the security and the safety net of the Ethereum L1, like this will move on, but there's always the risk that the users that only care about the user interface and like easiness to transact and build might just want to stay in that centralized one.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a scenario that feels relevant to think about, although perhaps an extreme point, like it would be probably like one of the worst failure modes of this L2 roadmap to say people are moving out. And to me, it feels like very dependent on two outcomes. The first one is, I think L2s do care about the fact that they are close to VL1 in the sense that there is liquidity and capital on VL1, and so they want to enjoy it. And so the best hedge to me is to actually make VL1 a place that is attractive for capital, so increase the DeFi footprint on L1 and things like this. So yeah, our plans of scaling VL1, I feel like provide a good hedge against that. Like what we've heard from many L2s is they don't think actually the world is a good place where like the world where VL1 is small and sort of like just this very minimal hub, and VL2s are supposed to be holding most of the capital. Like they don't think it's like the perfect world, and it's probably good to have like a very strong center so that that energy also radiates throughout the edges. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is about scale of the data availability offering on Ethereum. That was something that L2s have told us pretty loud and clear for the last couple of years that, yeah, if they're happy to be here, I think at least they might tell us that, but they're not happy if we can't provide them enough data availability. And so that's what we call like the blobs. And here also we have a scaling roadmap for blobs. Like we had this Fusaka upgrade in December that started to lay out like a really foundational way of like scaling the blobs to an order of magnitude, I guess, higher. And I think this has, at least in my sense, for now, addressed most of the scaling concerns that the L2s had in terms of the blobs, which is their raw material to buy data availability from Ethereum. So yeah, I feel like as long as the value proposition of VL1 to VL2s is good enough, and they are not blocked by like technical obstacles like the amount of blobs that they can buy, it feels to me like it's a good enough hedge against L2s potentially feeling like, oh, VL1 is just not useful to me anymore as a product.
Interesting. I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about like the broader motions going on right now in the Ethereum Foundation. And over the past like 10 to 12 months, we could say that Ethereum Foundation has entered like a wartime arc, or at least it's like how Vitalik like to picture it. It brought treasury reforms, like tighter governance. I want to know like first like what was your like impression of these like change in prioritization within the Ethereum Foundation, how it influenced protocol design decisions, and how like you think like this will translate into like Ethereum improvements moving forward.
Yeah, I think it started to be really visible around March 2025. So we had like a change of co-executive directors, and that started like a series of changes internally to the foundation, such as the protocol restructure that happened in June. To me, having been like at the foundation like throughout this, I feel like it probably started a little bit earlier than this, maybe in the summer of 2024. Like we started feeling, it doesn't feel like the momentum is increasing. And at the time, crypto Twitter was also extremely adversarial. It's not the only signal, but I think it was one signal that also, yeah, people were just not very satisfied. Like we were thinking a lot about the long-term research, at least from a protocol perspective. We were also having, I guess, limited engagement with the ecosystem. We always have like quite a bit of engagement, but it felt like we could probably do more of that. And so there was like quite a lot of discussions around, yeah, how can we do better? Like, how do we just like set ourselves up to do a better job? And I think we just addressed like some common criticisms that existed. So the first one being we look too much in the long term, and so people want to know that Ethereum is going to deliver value in the short term. So that's something that really drove this idea of like strategic priorities that we had, like scaling VL1, scaling the blobs, improving the UX. Yeah, again, like for instance, like scaling the blob was really coming from this signal from VL2 saying that if we don't have enough scale, I guess just no reason for us to be around. So taking these signals like to heart and really like driving the foundation to deliver results on this. So yeah, thinking a bit about the short term, that was like the first thing. Second thing, I think, was to make ourselves a bit more legible. Like a common criticism was we don't really know how you think about things, or like we just see like a flurry of if research posts and communications that is sometimes like very discoordinated. And a lot of it is by design. Like we do think of ourselves as being part of like this decentralized ecosystem where we want the emergence of like many voices and many opinions and everything. But I think it has limits when most of the communications come from like one organization, which is the Ethereum Foundation. And so actually increasing the legibility to me makes it more defensible to do certain things, such as, very strong research in sometimes opinionated directions. And I think that has helped realize that, there's no boogeyman in the shadows. Like we are just people working on these things in a very, dull sometimes manner, but at least letting people know that this is happening, I think has been helpful. Yeah, and then the third thing is probably having to do with ecosystem engagement broadly. So like Tomasz, I think people who was like the co-executive director who announced like 2 weeks ago that he was resigning and moving on to like different things. Yeah, he started like impulsing this idea of, you have to talk like broadly to the community. You have to go meet DeFi projects. You have to go meet DAOs. You have to really make noise about all the stuff that's happening on the network, because a lot of stuff is happening and we just haven't highlighted that enough in the past, perhaps. And yeah, I feel like with these three things, so thinking more about the short term, being more legible, and being more open, and like really becoming more of like an amplifying mechanism for good things that are happening, like that actually allowed us to be more effective on the things that we really care about, which is we summarize it as crops. So it's like censorship resistance, open source, privacy, and security. Yeah, these things, they are like our values. They are things that are really important to us, but we also need to like drive them practically on the network. And doing all these three things has just helped us like be just more effective at chasing after these higher abstractions of or higher ideals that we have as a foundation. Yeah.
You think like the Ethereum Foundation before like was a bit trying too much a bit to speculate on like the how the space would look like in 10 years and trying to optimize for that rather than like optimize for like the next 6 to 18 months?
Yeah, I don't know that it was even trying to predict what the space would be in 10 years. I think it was more that what's the perfect protocol in 10 years? And you don't necessarily think about always who's going to use it. Like it's very first principles driven. Like it's you want to be maximally censorship resistant, maximally open source, maximally private, maximally secure. All of these things, like I think they're table stakes, and these are things we're always chasing after. But that leads you sometimes to make decisions in a vacuum, perhaps, where you're not asking yourself like how people are using your protocol today and what do they need. And you're only asking yourself like, how do we design this perfect object that will last the test of time? And I think this is important. Like I actually think it's important to have like a very ambitious, long-term driven vision. But I actually think it's more helpful to realize it, to think about the short-term problems that you encounter, because the design space is so wide open for a protocol that satisfies like all of these things maximally, that to find your way around, and there's a lot of path dependency on who you're talking to, who is using your platform, etc. But I think it's actually narrowing yourself, narrowing your focus to what's just in front of you sometimes is actually very beneficial to achieving that long-term vision, because it just it helps you like cross the abyss in multiple steps instead of trying to make that long jump and get to the end point already. Yeah.
It almost sounds like, I guess, one of the core challenges with the old way that the Ethereum Foundation was thinking is that it was almost thinking as if it was the only game in town, in the sense that like we're trying to build the best thing in 10 years, but we might not be realizing that like, well, in 10 years, because we've been prioritizing so much for the long term, we might have lost some users on the way. And I guess like this is like what's the new focus is trying to prioritize a bit more for like retaining builders, retaining users, scaling the L1, that sort of thing. Would you say that's correct?
In a way, I think it is. Yeah, I I don't think it's like it's definitely not a rejection of the long-term focus. I think this is still extremely strong, and for us, one of our, I guess, differentiating aspects, like to have more of this first principle idea of what the chain should be, what the network should be, and how that will eventually drive value to users who care about these properties. But yeah, I think shifting gears a little bit has been helpful, almost as a way to get closer to that ideal. I don't even think we always thought we were the only game in town. Like, I feel like we spent quite a bit of time thinking about what other networks are doing and how that might be either a positive thing to think about or a negative thing maybe to defend against. But yeah, I do think sometimes the goals might be a little different, and sometimes, yeah, for ourselves more in the long term, and for other networks perhaps more closely aligned with, yeah, what current users like think about and need. Yeah.
What do you think about like the broader like concept of like competition? Like we've seen a lot of people like kind of attacking like the L1 valuation thesis, saying that like because block space is being commoditized like over the world, and there's like there's a lot of like different like bridging and interoperability solutions that are absolutely not perfect, but might be reducing the switching costs low enough that like you are almost always at the risk of like losing market share in a way to your competitors. Like how do you think about like that vision of like the competitive landscape between like different block space providers?
Yeah, I feel like I've heard quite a lot this idea of, well, block space actually fungible and a commodity at this point because there's so much of it. I feel like in the very recent uh, past, maybe last few weeks or month, people started like going back to that thesis and questioning it and saying, well, actually, maybe that's not true. At least to me, like the network effects of state feel extremely important. And we were in the rapid fire questions, you were asking like, what's the most underrated thing about Ethereum? And I was saying it's like so resilient as a community. But I think the reason why it's so resilient as a network is because the state of Ethereum is so has been like so large and so developed over the last 10 years. There's quite a lot of liquidity on it. People like are still issuing more and more assets and stable coins and digitally native assets and things like this. So that all comes down to, yeah, people are where the activity is, and this is self-reinforcing and kind of difficult to knock out of equilibrium. It's not impossible, and I think like again over time things can happen where, as you say, the friction with other networks reduces because interoperability gets better. The momentum on Ethereum is lost, and so people start thinking twice about issuing like certain things or doing certain activities on Ethereum. But broadly speaking, I think if we manage to stoke the fire of these network effects and just like keep them alive and continue to really make sure that they strengthen over time and not the other way around, I actually think that, yeah, this is a good position to be. It's not unassailable, but it is something that we can use to our advantage, at least for the moment. Yeah.
You've mentioned before that the EF has started to be a lot more involved in broader discussions with different builders in the ecosystem. And that's definitely a great thing to be hearing about, like what the people are doing right now. I'm really curious to know like what are like the DeFi developments that really like help like shift your priorities. Like are there like has there been any like big DeFi breakthroughs that like have made you reconsider some protocol designs or like some prioritization for like new improvements? And more broadly, if you could talk a bit about the right balance between like talking to players in the ecosystem and like credible neutrality as a foundation.
Yeah. So let's see. So the first piece of news, I guess, that was released maybe last week as we're recording this. We have a DeFi team at the Ethereum Foundation now, and they released a statement piece on the Ethereum blog discussing like what are their goals and how they see like this space. it's a bit like a desk, I guess, where people can come in and ask questions, and also, yeah, there's people internally that can think about the state of DeFi. Yeah, how can we move forward like these properties of censorship resistance and privacy, like through the DeFi ecosystem as it exists today? So have like a bit of a dialogue, I guess, between the foundation and the DeFi world. From where I stand, I think there's been a lot of interesting things. Like I'm more of a lurker, I guess, but I've been reading like things about how vaults are developing, like these aspects of risk curation, risk management, like institutional adoption of these vaults. It ties in a little bit with the topic of interop, which I'm also thinking about, like how uh, people think about deploying assets in different places and how these assets then move around, and the standards that are maybe underlying them. So yeah, I do see that there's a lot of activity there, especially as stable coins are becoming like more and more of a super retail product, and people have them and they want to put them to use, so they go on Coinbase and put them in vaults. So this is like really developing quite quickly, and I think there's really like a lot of opportunities to think about what this looks like as an Ethereum product, or as a DeFi on Ethereum product, let's say. And your second question, I forgot what it was. Maybe you can just
Second
tell me
question
again.
was around like the balance of like talking to people and credible neutrality.
Oh yeah,
Talk to everyone, so you have to you maybe you talk to the big ones, and maybe the big ones are prioritizing their own agenda.
yeah. I think it's credible neutrality is a principle, and then there is the principle put into action. That's where I think there's a lot of leeway for the foundation to operate, and especially the people within the foundation. There's some fairly clear guidelines around. Yeah, there's no the foundation shouldn't be kingmaking. The foundation shouldn't be like dropping legitimacy on projects that maybe either don't deserve it, or that should be spread like more widely around. I don't think it means the foundation should do nothing and just like stay behind. So what it did, for instance, is we have a team now which is founder support, which I think their idea is they're going to be like at the bottom of the funnel, essentially. Like they're going to talk to like many would-be founders, and they're going to try to nurture these talents. And it doesn't mean that every talent needs to be nurtured the same. I think over time, like you see, people are just, they have different ideas, they have different drives, different ambitions. And so, yeah, you just want to be able to figure out like who over time like manages to really like build something significant on Ethereum. You have also a team in the ecosystem cluster that is about enterprise acceleration. So they talk to big companies. They also talk to DeFi native companies. I feel like they're trying a lot to be open to many different use cases, and at the same time, there is an opinionated vision around where we do want certain types of things that are more private, more censorship resistant, more open. And so our focus will inevitably narrow towards people and businesses that have some of these properties that we are more that we relate to, I guess more. So yeah, in a way, like it is a principle. It's something that needs to be put into action and just discussed. Like it's hard to say ex ante, this is everything that needs to happen. Like it's very deliberative. Sometimes there's oversteering in one direction, and then people internally or externally would say, that was kind of strange. And then we'll just like look back at the tape and say, okay, yeah, we can calibrate differently. But at least we should go out and do that work, because doing it like from a remote place, I think doesn't work. That's been clear to me.
Great. Trying to recenter the discussion a bit on the protocols improvements going forward. It seems like you've been really focused on interop, fast finality, and related areas. Like, is the goal mainly to improve the UX of the L1 at the moment? Is it also maybe like related to like this new shift in priorities at DEF? I would love also if you can just go over like these different topics like interop, fast finality, and explain like in layman's term, like what do they unlock. The average DeFi user, the average user on Ethereum might not understand like what these stuff can really like improve for themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess my journey through these topics started really last year, I was trying to think a lot about how the different service providers of Ethereum, so like the nodes, stakers, and stuff like this, like should be organized. And I realized, well, actually, if I want to understand like how they should organize themselves, I should understand the service that they are providing and who consumes that service and why. And so that brought me to ask, well, why is Finality helpful in the first place? Like, why is interop helpful in the first place? And what I realized is, well, this really has to do with increasing the quality or the amount of demand on Ethereum. So the more these properties are improved, the more I think demand can be obtained for Ethereum. So it's a little bit different in a way, almost than scaling improvements that are more about like increasing the supply, which in its own way can create its own demand. But I think Finality, interop, short slots as well, they have this ability to just increase the amount of capital or the amount of users that want to transact on chain. And so, yeah, then we started thinking about it in terms of we have like different places where we can act. So the first one is Finality. So Finality means Ethereum tells you that it's not going to revert a transaction that happens. So I send money to you, Finality happens, we are almost like very certain that there is no more risk that the transaction ever gets reverted or re-returned or I do a double spend or something like this. And Ethereum gives you Finality by having like this validator set, which is super large, come to consensus over what the state of the chain is, like if I sent you money or not. And because the validator set is so large, Finality today is obtained in 15 minutes about. It's still like extremely high quality Finality. We call it economic Finality because there is this property that if ever there is a double spend, a lot of money will be lost. And so it's almost like this credible commitment to I will harm myself a lot if something bad happens. And so that should be like taken as a very strong promise. And why people use it is you might, for instance, issue assets on Ethereum, and then you want to know when finality happens because you want to know that these assets were issued on the ledger and they're not going to like be reverted. Or when you have the L2s that talk to the L1, some of them like also depend on finality to know, okay, Ethereum is stable enough and I can take data from Ethereum and pull it on my L2 to treat it or to use the data one way or another. And so the slower finality is, the more latency there is in the system, broadly speaking. And latency just translates into capital cost because that means you have to leave your capital in one place for longer until like something else checks out on the other domain. Or you have to have insurance buffers in case there is a reversion before finality has happened. So yeah, generally speaking, just like broader cost of capital. And so having faster finality means that across the board, the network just becomes cheaper to use, like more seamless, more frictionless for capital to move around. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when we consider the network as the L1 plus the L2s. So that's one improvement. The second improvement that we discuss a lot and that also like really serious about is the block time on L1. So today it's 12 seconds. So every 12 seconds there's a new block. That means the L1 data only refreshes like every 12 seconds. And that means like when you go on Uniswap and you make a trade, like basically the prices are the prices that were maybe 12 seconds ago in the worst case, which is not ideal. And having like faster block times, for instance, 6 seconds or even like shorter, I hope that we target things in the order of 2 seconds, perhaps in the future. That means like the prices refresh more often. It means like less value is lost to arbitrageurs that move value out of the system and re-equilibrate prices with other domains. And that means like more value stays within the system itself. So where finality might be a better improvement for everything that talks to the L1, so like asset issuers or L2s and stuff like this. To me, the L1 block time is a strong improvement for everything that happens on the L1, so all of the markets that are on the L1. And that just also like improves DeFi on the L1. And then maybe tying the two together, there's this idea of interop. So how do messages like pass around the system, generally speaking, or how does value like flow in the system? And there, I think there's a lot of basic UX problem in the sense that if I have some assets on Optimism and some assets on Ethereum, my wallet just shows me like, oh, you have if here, you have if there, and maybe some of it is like wrapped if, and it gets complicated. And the UX of like having these fragmented balances, having sometimes not the right token to pay for gas on the domains where I'm transacting, that's also pretty bad. So these UX problems, they're just like obstacles to retail adoption, essentially, that enters into failure modes of, oh, I thought I had one ETH and I could spend it, but actually it's in the wrong place, and so I can't use the thing on the app. And you just lose like a lot of potential demand from these very basic user issues. And so, yeah, so I think if we intelligently tackle these three things: finality, slot time, and just like cross-chain UX, broadly speaking, like through interop, I think suddenly like that offers a lot more value to the system as a whole, and that just drives more value to come in and to use the system without having all of this friction between them, and more value.
Very insightful. Yeah, and within all of these different topics, and more broadly talking about the roadmap, what do you think there's like one thing that people in the ecosystem should be more excited about?
I think they should be more excited about faster finality, generally speaking. Like that feels like it's been discussed quite a bit by infrastructure providers like L2s. It's something that I hear a lot from, yeah, builders who interact more directly with the L1 protocol. But yeah, it is something that is sometimes difficult to translate into super tangible user improvements. But I actually think it's like very important, and it is table stakes these days. Like there's a lot of chains that are launching with very fast finality in the order of seconds. So with our 15 minutes, like that's very, very slow. It's obviously like different. It is comparable, but it's not the same in the sense that the quality of finality also matters a lot. And Ethereum finality is just super high quality from having such a broadly diversified validator set. But yeah, there's still like reasonable trade-offs and technological progress that we can make on finality to make that a better offering from the Ethereum ecosystem. And I think people are super excited about ZK EVM, which is like also extremely exciting, and so, yeah, such a mind-blowing thing. And maybe less excited because finality feels more like this should be a soft run, but it's not. So we should be really excited about faster finality, and we should finally like get to a point where our finality is just like top notch, like super high quality, super low latency. And I think that should happen as soon as possible. Yeah.
But thanks for this, Barnabé. I want to know also a bit more about like your personal background, like your origin story of like how you got into Ethereum, but more broadly the concept of public blockchains, and what essentially like led you to what led it to become like a vocation, and what made you join the EF.
Yeah. So I left my hometown of Paris in 2014 to go do a PhD in Singapore. So my background was applied maths, mostly applied to finance actually. But over time, like I started really getting interested in game theory and economics more broadly. And so I left to Singapore, and I started this PhD in a branch called algorithmic game theory, so which is really at the intersection of economics, computer science, and a bit of engineering as well, to some extent. And what I was thinking about back there was the type of games that are called congestion games. So how do you model like a network that has traffic, and how do you model the congestion on that network? And there's an idea there that is actually very general, that is called the price of anarchy. And it's this idea that you want to look at the system from a place where there's a omnipotent optimizer that just directs all the flows so that the congestion as a whole is like the lowest possible on the system. And the same system but decentralized, where every agent makes their own decision through the network, and they are just trying to optimize their own travel time and not the aggregate travel time of the network. And there are many strong results that show that there's a gap between the two. So if you had like this dictator, you could just have a much more optimized system. But because everybody is making their own decision, you have just inefficiency that arises as a result. And so, yeah, it was interesting to think about it because it gave me like almost like a theoretical foundation to think about centralized systems versus decentralized ones. And throughout my PhD, then something that was more accidental is my PhD advisor met Vitalik in Singapore. At the time, like some of the EF folks were hanging around like quite a bit over there. And they just started talking, and my advisor realized like they're thinking a lot about game theory, like for securing proof of stake, like for fee markets and all of these questions. And so we should just like start talking to them more. And over the course of my PhD, I just started being more and more involved in Ethereum. I was really interested into it as a research problem, perhaps more than as a technology at first. But over time, I also, just really fell in love with the community. I attended like some of the DEF cons in Prague in 2018 and Osaka. And yeah, it just felt like a super fun project to think about. So I just ramped up more and more over time. Yeah.
Interesting. And in your opinion, like what when you joined Ethereum, of course, like it was not just. I'm guessing it was not just about like, oh, it's a cool project. They are working on some like different topics that I've been studying for a long time. There's also like a soul to Ethereum. There's a lot of core values that you talked about. What do you think is one like core value, core characteristic that should be protected above everything else?
Yeah, I think that also maps to maybe the dilemma I was at the time. So I was considering my options, and I was thinking I could go and work for traditional, I guess, business models, especially in algorithmic game theory. This is the place where a lot of the theory behind ad auctions has been developed. And ad auctions is basically the main revenue engine for places like Google. So there's a lot of like Silicon Valley value that was created from that field of study. And I was considering, I could go and work for maybe like some of these places, or I could think about something that's closer to like these cities and go for Grab or Uber or Lyft or like these types of places where there's markets and you're trying to think about like the game theory and the pricing and these things behind it. But one thing that I felt was maybe missing and that Ethereum had was this idea that it's not just about like making existing systems more efficient, and especially existing systems that rely on strong centralized platform like Facebook or like Uber, but it's about like a completely new type of system where the market itself is just like a protocol and it's not really owned by anyone, or it can be owned by everyone, like depending on your framing. And there's just like a strong, credible set of rules that govern the market, and nobody can just extract value from this or more value than is required for the market to function properly. And I thought this was like just a really interesting thing. Like I almost couldn't believe that it could exist because obviously like there's been so much thinking and so much tech and so much research that behind the existing two-sided markets as we know them. But I thought that might actually be like a very interesting problem to tackle and to think about, because with the technology of blockchain, as I understood it at the time, with these cryptographic improvements that feel like magical and with this global distributed consensus, suddenly like the things might actually be in place to take these systems and like suddenly make them better. And I think this has been, at least to me, the solo Ethereum was to look at things as they were and say, actually, you can just completely flip that and do something different, and that's better for the user and for the market and for society as a whole. So yeah, that's my interpretation of it at the very least.
Super interesting. And I guess following up on that, what is your thought right now on the increased institutional adoption of Ethereum? Like, there's definitely, I wouldn't say that like the past for couple of years has seen a lot of retail adoption in crypto in general. One area where like the adoption has definitely be very visible is the institutional adoption. Do you think like it's of course a great thing and a great validation for Ethereum as a space, and in a way, institutions almost value the credible neutrality of Ethereum more than some of the retail folks, which it should help more in a way. What do you think about the benefits of institutional adoption, and do you like what do you think specifically about the risk that they take too much space and might drive like compromises that might result in Ethereum losing its soul?
Yeah, I think it's again like goes back to this push and pull, I guess, between are we making the existing systems more efficient, or are we porting the old system like to a new system? And I think this is what people are, or at least how I interpret like this fight that we have over what the soul of Ethereum is. So obviously happy that people are paying attention. Like I think it's great validation, as you said, that institutions come in and they say, actually, we prefer platforms that are stable, that don't go down, that offer features like privacy and care about it, or that have strong plans in place for post-quantum resistance, because these are things that, yeah, people think of it as risk, and we want to minimize risk for our asset depositors. So yeah, I think all of this is good. And the question is, are we building better rails for their internal operations, or are we just like building a system in which they exist as part of that broader system? And I think it's not like actually decided. Like I do think, to me, the version that looks like we build a better system overall is BlackRock comes in, they issue their assets, they want them to be permissionless, they want them to be available like through Uniswap pools, they allow broad access to these assets, maybe with much lower barriers to entry for retail investors or for even other institutional investors that are perhaps like in different parts of the world, for instance. So that to me feels like, yeah, a better version of the existing systems, like where access is just much more democratized and verifiable, and we take the properties of Ethereum and we allow them to be used by other institutions. The thing that look maybe less rosy to me is institutions just porting their existing access controls and hard coding them into token rules. Like at the end of the day, Ethereum is just a piece of tech, right? And you can use it however you want, and you can write token standards that are extremely restrictive. But then people would feel that, oh, that's just a missed opportunity, because we have seen these models of like ERC20, ERC721s, where you can just like freely move them around, and there's all these cool things that like permissionless innovation, permissionless composability, that all emerges from having like as low barriers and as low friction as possible in the system. So I don't think it will ever be like, yeah, black or white. I think we'll just always have to keep defending why our way of doing things is just better value for people who participate, as opposed to them trying to create or recreate their fenced walled gardens inside the system itself. But generally speaking, I think I'm generally very positive that more institutions are paying attention. I think it's just been, first, it's been good to talk to them and just have like a lot of input and feedback from how they think about stuff, from what they need from the chain, from what their users need from their infrastructure. And second, I also think, yeah, it can be a chance that more capital is around, that also funds more innovation. That means there's more momentum. That means, yeah, generally speaking, I think activity is good, and we should generally be welcoming to it.
But do you think there might be like a rising problem of like institutions trying to focus specifically on, I guess, like more custodial type structures? Like they are just trying to recreate like their back office on a public blockchain, but essentially like having the same level of guardrails that they have internally, and not really benefiting from like the full composability and the full like I guess like self-custodial aspects of crypto that's like native. What do you think, like if in 10 years like everything in crypto is just like exchanging different IOUs, like what we're seeing right now being like really catching a lot of attention is just RWAs, but at the end of the day like RWAs are just IOUs. And so what do you think happens to Ethereum if like it's just becoming like a back office tool to exchange things that people don't have true self-custody of?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I generally don't see the idea of Ethereum being a back office like purely negative. I think it depends like what it's being used for. One thing I would say is, the stronger we can make Ethereum as a product, the more aligned the institution way of doing things will be with Ethereum properties and Ethereum goals of censorship resistance and security. So, for instance, we do see like RWAs yeah, as you say, they are IOUs, like somebody holds something off chain and then there's a representation of it on chain. But there's still, I think, a lot of ways to make that on-chain representation as free and permissionless as possible. And that's using essentially Ethereum Rails. So you want the token to be able to move around freely through, for instance, roll-up canonical bridges. You want the token to benefit from all the infrastructure that makes Ethereum censorship resistance when you issue it on-chain. And the reasons why it might not be is because sometimes because our finality is so slow or because interop is so expensive or these different things, people will use like third-party services or third-party bridges to perform these services instead of Ethereum. And so what that means is that the ledger of record, in a sense, of these assets, instead of being Ethereum and just like the Ethereum state transition function, is just like an alternative service providers. And many of them, like their business offerings they're very relevant, like they solve actual problems that token issuers have. But yeah, there's always trade-offs. And I think as much as we can do, or as much as we can improve the tech of Ethereum, that just reduces the incentive for tokens or for representations or for assets, generally speaking, to use different rails than the Ethereum rails that were purpose built for this security and this censorship resistant and hopefully in the future privacy as well. And so I think it's on us, like it puts the ball in our court to make sure that we have the best product and we don't just go to people and say, hey, you should be using our stuff because it's better. And people will say, well, no, it's not, because if it was, then I would be using it. So yeah, it's on us to like improve all of this, make sure that the rails are the best to develop on. So developer experience, I think, is important. The rails are the cheapest in many ways, like both in cost and in latency. The rails have the most network effects as well. So I think building in composability, building in censorship resistance, to me, like they feel like good product features because that means your asset, your token can just compose in many different places. So distribution is much better. Yeah. So all of that I think is work that we have to do. And I actually think it's like very like some of it has to do with protocol changes. And recently we released like this straw map, so like a straw man roadmap of a protocol that details like all of these features that we want to bring. But in what I discussed, like a lot of it, I think to me are not protocol features, like they're more product features of Ethereum as a whole. And I think it's at this point equally important to spend time thinking about what the Ethereum experience looks like for these different institutions or these different asset issuers than it is like thinking about the protocol features as we traditionally understand them.
Interesting. And do you think that maybe like one of the reasons why like these like custodial structures are getting so much traction is because they might like the institutions might be a bit scared of like purely crypto native products, and in that sense, like, do you think that like more like insurance type products, coverage, for different like DeFi protocols and for like the broader usage of crypto native protocols in general could be like the real enabler for these institutions to essentially like trust the actual like public and decentralized tech more? And how do you think of insurance and coverage as a way to save the soul of Ethereum by by keeping the innate properties that the institutions might care about and want?
Yeah, I think I guess I'm not like the most in-depth on the current offering of insurance product. I can talk about it in very broad terms, but one of them is basically like risk management. So I think it's much better to have access to a product that allows you to set the slider how you want for risk, as opposed to just not having access to that product and then deciding, do I take full risk of like putting my assets on DeFi and then something might happen, or do I just not participate in the market? So I do see insurance as a good way to patch this gap, and I think it's anyways an essential feature of many different systems. Like we want the most things to be on chain, and the ideal obviously is that everything is verifiable, code is low, there's no counterparty risk. But I think people are also realistic that these types of systems, like they cover perhaps more limited use cases. Like there's always going to be stuff that happens off chain, or banks and central banks and asset issuers. Like there's always going to be dependencies that are just not governed by the Ethereum state transition function. And so there, I think some amount of insurance might be helpful. Otherwise, I think, the more we make this Ethereum product feel secure, feel strong, DeFi protocols being safe, audited, smart contracts being safe, interaction with smart contracts also being safe. For instance, clear signing is something that we've been thinking about quite a bit, given like recent hacks that had to do with people just signing things that were corrupted on their wallets. Um, Hopefully that over time reduces the need for insurance, but at the very least, like, it can make sense in the world that we are in today to have that option. It incurs a greater cost of capital, obviously, and hopefully that can be just reduced with better tech. But when it's not, I think it's definitely a good option. Yeah.
Yeah, what we're trying to do at Symbiotic is like work with like a couple of people building in the insurance space and kind of like use Symbiotic as like the staking like hub for people to that have collateral that they can take risk, and any type of risk in crypto and maybe even outside of crypto, using like the staking logic as like the, I guess, like the broader way to like do like a risk underwriting, and to do like to have like a risk transfer market. So this is what we've been building. But um one last question I wanted to ask you is, if you had to reflect on like your journey in crypto and in the Ethereum Foundation more broadly, like what do you think is one like core belief that has that has shifted, or that you have essentially like debunked since your early days?
I think for me personally, it's that not everything is a research problem. Like sometimes I wanted to take the position of, well, we have to think about the design space and map the trade-offs and say, we can choose any pointing there, but at least we are informed about it. And it was not always like super clear to me, like how do you actually get to choose the point on the curve that makes sense? And the perspective that I feel I've adopted more, and that also people have adopted, broadly speaking, that meta has changed, like away maybe from research and more towards what people maybe call product. And again, I'm more of an outsider and a beginner in that perspective. But yeah, that's the thing to me that tells us this is the point you should be picking. So it's understanding what your users need today, understanding what your users or your future users might need tomorrow, and then building the system so that you answer these needs, and you make like the right trade-offs by trying to deliver as much value to your users. And you can be opinionated about what that value looks like. Like it doesn't have to be always just maximizing some kind of dollars and cents balance sheet. It can also be maximizing core properties that we care about, like opportunity of access, privacy, all of these different things. But yeah, it has to come from a place of having a vision for what the users of your system need and want from your system. And that work is very hard. Like it's sometimes I feel much harder than the research work, which is more about what's happening in your own head, or more and more what's happening in conversation with your agents. But yeah, it requires you to go out into the world and talk to people and understand like their mental models and understand how they think. And yeah, at least to me, it's been like a really productive mindset shift. And I think it's also been the case for people even in the foundation and outside. So that's my main. I don't know if it's. I don't think it debunks research, but it definitely like re-rates it and its goals, to me at least. Yeah.
Nice. Great. By the way, I had an amazing time discussing the past hour with you. Before we end this, do you mind sharing maybe your socials and where can people learn more about what you're doing at DA?
Sure. I post sometimes on Twitter. I'm at Barnabé Monnot, so that's my first name and family name. You can also find me on Telegram at the same handle. I'm always happy to chat or reach out, DM on Twitter. That's also fine.
Great. Barnabé, thank you so much for coming on the Blueprints podcast. And to the audience, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.